this will mean possibly higher food and fuel costs, and also just higher costs in terms of the goods that we buy on a daily basis.
Transnet workers are on strike and South Africa's ports are effectively at a standstill. What does this mean for the current state of South Africa's economy? Well, joining me to discuss is Chris Hattingh, my colleague at the Centre for Risk Analysis. So Chris, you focus quite a lot on trade policy in your work. How is this Transnet strike going to be impacting on the economy? And could you provide us with some details of what is being negotiated at the moment?
Thanks, David. So the strike, which is now over a week old, is basically around wage disputes. The unions who are participating, they're demanding inflation-linked or inflation-hedged wage increases, which would be above 7%, around 7% or just above. So the latest offer from Transnet was at 4.5%, and that was rejected as we're recording on here on the 17th of October. So strike still ongoing for the time being. Another requirement from the unions was a guarantee that no layoffs would happen in the future. I think that's quite a difficult position to put Transnet in, given Transnet is trying to reconsolidate, to cut some costs, to be more efficient with their spending and their operations in the future. So I don't think they're going to cede to that demand. We are seeing a bit of maybe a last stand, I would say, with Transnet, with this current back and forth. If they buckle on this, then I don't foresee how they can hold out in the future. So this might be where they're trying to draw a very clear line in the sand. In terms of the economic effects, this is definitely exacerbating and exposing those underlying issues that have afflicted Transnet for the last 5 to 10 years, at least, in terms of their own inefficiencies with management, with operations, with basic running of rail and ports. At the moment, again, here as we record on the 17th of October, we're getting reports and indications that in terms of the water side operations at the country's ports, those are struggling a lot, very few things moving through at the moment. And in terms of land side operations, things are effectively at a standstill. So goods, materials simply not moving through either out of the country or into the country. And then I think if the strike continues for much longer, we're going to see serious shortages of products right around the country.
So Transnet port terminals, they've actually declared force majeure to their creditors, citing this strike action as an inability to meet their loan commitments. This is quite a calamitous situation. What about the actual economic costs? Because as we highlighted in our risk alert of this week, there's some pretty significant implications for exporters as well as importers.
So especially for exporters and operators in the mining and agricultural sectors, the strike will affect them most harshly. Those have been two lights in the dark South African economic landscape, really holding up economic activity over the last year. Again, riding the commodities boom. So those mining exporters will have benefited from higher demand for raw materials in places such as Europe, North America, and China. But that boom will be coming to an end relatively soon, given the depressed global economic environment. I do think those exporters are going to now try and move their operations, or at least some of them, to countries like Namibia and the port at Maputo to try and get their goods into the rest of the continent and into the rest of the world, in terms of Europe especially. We're also now focusing on the medium-term budget statement coming up from Minister Godongwana. So the strike is going to mean lower tax revenues, lower tax collection for the government, for the fiscus, so less spending capacity for the government itself. And then just in terms of basic economic activity, this will mean possibly job losses, the cutting back of operations as exporters struggle to fund their operations if they can't get as much revenue for their goods, if they can't get the same quantity out as they did before. This will have effects right up and down their own value chains and supply chains. And then in terms of the consumer, this will mean possibly higher food and fuel costs, and also just higher costs in terms of the goods that we buy on a daily basis. We're already exposed to higher inflation costs in terms of imported inflation because our manufacturing capacity isn't so good. We import more complex goods into the country. So now that it's going to take longer for us to import those, importers will factor that into their costs, and South Africans as a consequence will suffer.
Okay, so we're seeing a lot of inflationary pressures. This strike is going to contribute to that. And now, what does this mean in terms of the broader policy environment, Chris? Because in many ways, there is a typical story here in terms of South Africa's state-owned enterprises. The government insists on holding on to these assets. Then there's this concentration risk when some kind of political economy crisis develops, then everybody suffers. Thinking of Eskom, you name any other SOE, and the problems are similar. So how do we find our way out of this broader problem of our over-reliance on Transnet?
Well, we have seen overtures toward reform, the rhetoric of reform. So the idea that there'll be a 2-year pilot period where some railway slots, for example, will be opened up to private sector investment. This is what Transnet has indicated. But the caveat is that Transnet will remain the custodian of that infrastructure. So you're asking private sector investors, local and foreign, to invest billions of rands of capital, but then Transnet can take that infrastructure and the upgrades at any point if they so desire in the future. So you need to remove those caveats and I think open up for real private sector takeover of port and rail operations. And there's also a strong argument to be made for the devolution and localization in a good way, because I'm not a fan of localization from a national policy perspective, but localization in terms of devolving some of the responsibility and powers for running the ports to local municipalities. For Cape Town especially, I think this is an area to explore, to take over some of those operations at the ports in Cape Town and make sure that things are put on a much better track, that there's an improvement in terms of basic operations happening, just getting containers from ships out of the harbor, making sure there's enough truck capacity, make sure that you can track containers and goods easily, that it's all transparent, that your paperwork is easy to process and to solve. So those things I think can happen, but you need to make sure that local municipalities, I think, can take charge of those operations instead of it just being on Transnet as a parastatal, which is struggling very clearly to handle the basics of trade infrastructure.
And getting back to this strike specifically, Chris, how do you see this wage bargaining process unfolding?
I want to say that I hope it'll be resolved within the next week, but at this point in time, given the union's demands and the difficult fiscal position that Transnet is in, I don't see that impasse being reached anytime soon. I know some private businesses have said that they're willing to pay to fund some of these demands, to pay to make sure that operations keep going again. A part of me hopes that that doesn't happen, because then it just papers over the cracks for the next time. So you sort of try and solve the issue in a very short-termist way, but it doesn't resolve the underlying issues of just how much power the unions have at Transnet and at other state-owned enterprises. So if Treasury and other players in government can hold the line and continue to talk about and implement at least some measure of fiscal responsibility, one hopes that they don't accede to the demands. But of course, you always have that risk as you have political pressures, election pressures, that could also play a factor in terms of not wanting to lose support, wider societal support and votes, if, for example, workers are laid off or wage demands aren't acceded to. My personal view is that the strike will continue for at least another 2 to 3 weeks.
Chris Hattingh, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. How do you think the Transnet strike will impact on South Africa's economy? Are you being directly affected by this strike? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section. Also, if you enjoyed this analysis, you might want to become a subscriber to the CRA's services. We have a number of client risk alerts and reports, one of which we spoke about today in this video. There is a link in the description below where you can find out more. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.